While physical proximity among people has become a dimension where special care is needed, how do we socially relate? Are exclusion and separation dictating our interactions? Or are these based on solidarity, hospitality, and inclusion?
De weken voor Pasen zijn een periode van bezinning en inkeer. In deze 40 dagen tijd, ook wel lijdenstijd of vastentijd genoemd, leven christenen toe naar het paasfeest. De docenten van het doopsgezind seminarium geven ieder vanuit hun eigen vakgebied een korte reflectie over deze periode, in aanloop naar Pasen. Vandaag André Pacheco Lozano, postdoctoraal onderzoeker vredestheologie en ethiek aan het doopsgezind seminarium.
Good day to everyone, and welcome to this Menno moment. We're currently living in strange times. Our relations with space, with ourselves, and with others have been altered. We live in times, it seems to me, where it is easy to be centered in ourselves. The amount of information we see and read becomes so overwhelming that it is hard to discern what is truly important or urgent. In the midst of these realities, I recollect the experience, wisdom, and spirituality of the campesino communities in the country I grew up, Colombia. In my personal journey, looking at their example remains to be a source of inspiration, challenge, and a horizon of hope in difficult times. A couple of years ago, I had the privilege to be part of one contextual Bible study with one campesino group in the northeast of Colombia. This community, mostly living off the production of cacao, corn, and fruits, has been in a struggle for their land. A landlord and illegal armed groups have tried hard to push this community out of their land. With this campesino group, we read the text of 1 Kings chapter 21, titled Naboth's Vineyard. As we read it, the community immediately drew connections between their own experience and the ones reported in this biblical account. Just as Naboth refused to sell his land to the king Ahab, the community has refused to either sell or leave their land to the threatening landlord. This campesino community has resisted nonviolently, supported by their faith and spirituality. On the one hand, they are convinced, similarly to Naboth, that God is walking with them. They constantly pray, have vigils, and organize liturgical moments seeking for strength and interceding for the change of heart of the landlord. On the other hand, they are convinced that, in order to live their faith, non-violence is the only way to resist the continuation of the cycles of violence. The land struggle of this community is not an isolated case. In fact, the issue of land possession and concentration in the hands of a few families has been one key factor that has generated and sustained the long-term armed conflict in Colombia. As a result, more than 7 million people have been internally displaced. Among the most affected are the campesino communities, particularly women and children. Coming back to the biblical story. The campesino group interpreted that what was at the center of the text of Naboth's vineyard was not simply a conflict between two different parties over a given property. More fundamentally, there were two different understandings of land and space that clashed. Naboth describes land as inheritance. Land, in this sense, has a particular value as a gift or a blessing. This view stresses how people's identities and spiritual journeys are connected with land. Their presence in a given space is connected to their ancestors. At the same time, being inherited implies that people have the responsibility to care for this gift. This view is shared by the campesinos in Colombia. Who they are is defined by the bond which they have with the land. In fact, in Spanish, the word campesino denotes an interdependent relation between identity, belonging, land and water, and life in community. This is why it was easy for the campesino group to label Nabot also as a campesino. They identify a shared view of the land with this biblical character. The other concept of land and space is depicted by the king Ahab, who describes it as a garden or as a vineyard. From this perspective, land is a property, something to be owned, bought, and sold. Land has a value just in terms of production or extraction. In the case of the campesino community in Colombia, this view is well represented by the landlord and the armed groups who see the land as a resource for exploitation. These two different approaches to land and space have an impact on relationships, on how to relate with other bodies in space. For the approach that sees land as a property, people and bodies are seen as threats to earning, owning, and exploiting. Excluding or displacing seem to be ways of dealing with these obstacles. Whereas for the campesino approach, land is the space in which community is built. Years ago, we were planning a nonviolent action with this campesino community. Several NGOs and churches sent members to the community in order to support their action. We met in an open field, where there was no house or cover from the sun. In order to discuss the action and to have lunch, the community built a tent in the middle of the empty field of land within 30 minutes. They worked together in cutting trees, building the basic structure, and creating the roof with the leaves of platano trees. A perfect tent and a fire for a community soup was ready soon. That day, I learned that space for them had a deep connection with community building more than anything else. Solidarity, hospitality, desire of inclusion seem to be key aspects of this approach to land and space. Now, what can we learn from such a deep bond and connection with the land in our spaces and in this particular time? I think the point here is not simply to extrapolate the reality and connection with land of the campesino communities in Colombia to our daily life, nor is it to idealize or oversimplify a particular way in which we humans can connect with land and space. Yet, the experience of these communities, campesino communities, might help us raising questions and reflecting on how we relate with space. In times where movement has been restricted, it would be worth asking, what is our understanding and relationship with land and space? Do we see them as limitations? Do we see ourselves as being trapped in them? Or do we see land and space as contexts in which identity and relationships are forged, are built? How do we see ourselves and others in our homes, neighborhoods, and cities? While physical proximity among people has become a dimension where special care is needed, how do we socially relate? Are exclusion and separation dictating our interactions? Or are these based on solidarity, hospitality, and inclusion, even while keeping 1.5 meters distance? How do our faith and spiritual life connect to these specific spaces? I cannot help but thinking that a main concern in these times of COVID-19 has been limitations imposed to traveling and tourism, both of which are ways in which we seek to transcend the apparent limits of space. Interestingly, while some of us seek to escape to other places, some others, like the campesinos, search for ways to remain, to stay in the land. The point here is not so much to stigmatize our dreams and desires of traveling, but rather to give the opportunity to ourselves, especially in this time of Lent and in the midst of the reality of COVID-19, to look once again to our relationships with space and with others. May God guide us through this exploration and reflection. Amen.